The final 100 days of Hitler, when an empire collapsed underground. It was around 3:30 in the afternoon. Above the underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Berlin was no longer recognizable as the capital of a powerful nation. The streets were burning. Artillery fire shook the remaining buildings. From the east, the Red Army was pushing deeper into the city. German soldiers fought among the ruins. Some were experienced veterans. Others were barely old enough to be soldiers. Many were simply trying to survive another hour. But several meters beneath the destruction, inside a concrete bunker that had once served as a center of power, a man sat surrounded by maps, reports, and increasingly desperate decisions. He no longer possessed an army capable of winning the war.
There was almost nowhere left to retreat. There were no allies coming to rescue him. And perhaps most importantly, there was nowhere left to hide from reality. That man was Adolf Hitler. Only 100 days earlier, he was still the dictator of Nazi Germany. Now, he was approaching the final hours of his life. Within minutes, the man who had once commanded armies across much of Europe would take his own life. But the real question is not how Hitler died. The more important question is this: how did Germany reach this point in only 100 days? How did an army that had once advanced toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad end up fighting street by street for the ruins of Berlin?
Why did Hitler continue refusing to accept defeat when the outcome was becoming impossible to change? And why, even when almost everything around him had collapsed, were officers still discussing imaginary counterattacks over maps inside the Führerbunker? To understand the final days, we have to go back to the beginning. January 1945, the first days of the final 100. Day 100, the illusion of hope. January 1945. Germany was no longer the military power it had been during the early years of the war. In the east, the Red Army was advancing. The Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive had begun, and Soviet forces were moving west with astonishing speed.
For German soldiers, this was more than another battlefield setback. A massive enemy force was approaching the heart of Germany, and at the heart of Germany was Berlin. By the middle of January, Hitler had increasingly concentrated his existence inside the Führerbunker, the underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. It was supposed to function as a command center. Instead, it would become something else entirely. It would become the final island of Hitler's power. Above the bunker, Berlin still looked like the capital of Germany on a map. But every passing day made the city look more like a fortress waiting to be surrounded. Meetings continued. Officers arrived with reports. Maps were spread across tables. Front lines were marked and moved. Orders were issued. But there was a fundamental problem. The maps no longer represented reality. On paper, divisions still existed. On the battlefield, many of those divisions had been reduced to fragments. Units supposedly preparing for counterattacks were exhausted, retreating, or nearly destroyed. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was running low. Manpower was disappearing. Yet Hitler continued searching for a military solution. He believed that if the remaining forces could somehow be reorganized, Germany might still reverse the situation. Outside the bunker, however, reality was moving in the opposite direction. The Red Army was approaching the Oder River. Suddenly, Berlin was no longer a distant objective. Berlin was becoming the next battlefield. Day 79. The world was already thinking beyond Hitler. February arrived. While Hitler continued thinking about how the war might be prolonged, the Allied leaders were discussing something completely different. They were thinking about what would come after Germany's defeat. At Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin discussed the future of Europe, the future of Germany, the division of influence, the political structure of post-war Europe, reparations, and the new international order that would emerge after the conflict. The contrast was extraordinary. In one part of Europe, the leaders of the Allied powers were planning for the world after Nazi Germany. In another, deep beneath Berlin, Hitler was still trying to find a way to continue the war. One side was planning the future. The other was refusing to accept the end. Meanwhile, Soviet pressure continued in the east. In the west, American and British forces were breaking through German defenses. Above German cities, Allied bombers continued their attacks. Dresden became one of the most controversial and remembered examples of the destruction. But bombing was only part of Germany's problem. Even when soldiers were still willing to fight, supplying them became increasingly difficult. Railways had been damaged. Infrastructure was collapsing. Industrial production was under enormous pressure. The German war machine no longer functioned as it once had. From the outside, it could still appear enormous. Inside, however, it was slowly losing the ability to function. The machinery of war was still moving, but it was running out of fuel, resources, and time. Day 51. Was the war about victory anymore? March 1945. The Western Front was also deteriorating. Allied forces crossed the Rhine. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen provided the Allies with an important route across the river and accelerated their advance into Germany. In the south, the situation was not improving either. In Hungary, Germany's final major attempt to regain the initiative failed. Operation Spring Awakening could not reverse the strategic situation. In Italy, Allied forces were preparing for their final offensive. Look at the map, and the situation became increasingly obvious. Germany was being attacked from multiple directions. Yet inside the Führerbunker, Hitler continued ordering resistance. Something important had changed in his thinking. At the beginning of the war, military operations were designed to achieve victory. Now, the war was no longer about winning. It was increasingly about delaying defeat. Hitler viewed retreat almost as a form of betrayal. For him, surrender was not simply a military decision. Surrender meant admitting that everything had failed: the ideology, the army, the government, and the political project for which millions had already died. So the orders continued. Fight, hold the line, counterattack, do not retreat. Even when meaningful resistance was becoming almost impossible. A man drifting further away from reality. During these weeks, Hitler himself was changing. Physically, he appeared increasingly weak. His hands trembled. He suffered from digestive problems and severe sleep difficulties. His mobility was becoming more limited. But the deeper problem may have been psychological. His decisions were increasingly disconnected from the reality of the battlefield. He received reports. He studied maps. He listened to commanders. But at times, he seemed to believe what he wanted to be true, rather than what the battlefield was showing. Inside the bunker, the contradiction became more obvious every day. Commanders spoke about shortages. Reports described retreats. Units were disappearing. Yet Hitler talked about counterattacks. He discussed formations that existed mainly on paper. And this created one of the darkest contradictions of the final 100 days. A man increasingly disconnected from battlefield reality was still making decisions that affected millions of lives. Day 29. A brief moment of hope. April arrived. Germany was being squeezed from every direction. From the east came the Red Army. From the west came American and British forces. The southern fronts were collapsing. Yet on April 12th, news reached the Führerbunker that briefly changed Hitler's mood. Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, had died. For a moment, Hitler saw a possibility. Perhaps the new American leadership would clash with the Soviet Union. Perhaps the Allied coalition would begin to break apart. Perhaps Germany could exploit a disagreement between its enemies. For a short time, this seemed like another reason to continue. But the hope did not last. Because in the east, Soviet forces were preparing for the final assault on Berlin. April 16. The battle for the German capital was beginning. Day 14. The sky above Berlin turned to fire. On the morning of April 16, 1945, Soviet artillery opened fire. Huge numbers of Soviet troops began moving forward. Tanks advanced. Artillery continued pounding German positions. The Red Army was no longer trying merely to gain another piece of territory.
This time, the objective was unmistakable. Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces approached from the east. Ivan Konev's forces advanced from the south. Germany gathered almost everything it could still put into the defense. Remaining veterans, exhausted units, reserve formations, young recruits, members of the Hitler Youth, men who understood that their chances of survival were rapidly disappearing. Yet inside the bunker, Hitler continued staring at maps. He talked about forces that would supposedly launch counterattacks, units that would strike the Soviets from another direction. On paper, such operations could be drawn. But on the ground, many of the forces existed only as names on maps or were far too weak to carry out the orders. This may be the clearest image of the final 100 days. On paper, the army still existed. In reality, the army was disintegrating.
Day 10. The last birthday. April 20th. Hitler's birthday. But there was little left of the spectacle and confidence that had surrounded his earlier birthdays. Outside, Berlin was under enormous pressure. In the east, Soviet artillery was getting closer. Inside the city, civilians struggled to survive. And beneath the ground, the man who had once imagined conquering Europe was watching his political and military empire disappear. 4 days later, one of the most dramatic moments of the final 100 days occurred. April 22nd, the Situation Conference. Reports arrived. Reinforcements had not appeared. The expected counterattack had failed. Berlin could no longer realistically be saved. Then, Hitler exploded in anger. He shouted. He raged. And eventually, he acknowledged something he had resisted saying openly. The war was lost. For the first time, defeat was no longer simply something commanders were reporting. Defeat had entered the bunker itself. Until this moment, Hitler could still imagine that some military solution existed. After April 22nd, the nature of the story changed. The question was no longer, how can we win? It became, how does this end?
Day 7. A city fighting for every hour of existence. April 23rd. General Helmuth Weidling became commander of the defense of Berlin.
The mission given to him was almost impossible. Soviet forces were attacking from several directions. Artillery struck different parts of the city. Streets became battlefields. Every building could become a defensive position. But for ordinary civilians, the war was no longer about military strategy. They needed bread, water, fuel, shelter, and some way to survive until the next morning. Berlin was no longer simply a capital. It had become a city fighting for every remaining hour of existence in our planet. At the same time, something else was happening in Western Germany. American and Soviet forces were moving toward one another. On April 25, they met near the Elbe River. The moment had enormous symbolic importance. The forces advancing from east and west had finally made contact inside Germany. There was now nowhere left for Germany to retreat. The enemy had approached from both directions, and now those forces had met.
Inside the Führerbunker, the last circle of power. As the world above collapsed, the atmosphere inside the bunker became increasingly strange. Martin Bormann remained an important figure. Joseph Goebbels stayed beside Hitler. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl remained part of the military command structure. Weidling was responsible for Berlin's defense. But something else was becoming increasingly visible. Trust was disappearing. Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, had attempted to establish contact with the Western Allies. When Hitler learned about these efforts, he considered them an act of treason. In Hitler's mind, even negotiation at this stage could be betrayal. Hermann Göring had already fallen out of Hitler's favor. Himmler was now condemned as a traitor. And Fegelein, who was closely connected to Eva Braun, was arrested and executed. The regime was not merely collapsing from the outside. It was beginning to consume itself from within. Nobody could be certain who remained loyal, who was preparing to escape, who was considering negotiations, and who would still obey Hitler's orders.
April 28, the final betrayal. April 28, Soviet artillery was getting closer. Then Hitler learned more about Himmler's attempt to negotiate with the Allies. For Hitler, the news was more than a political setback. It was another sign that even people around him no longer believed in the future of the regime. But Hitler had already made his decision. If Berlin fell, he would not leave. If reinforcements arrived, resistance would continue. If they did not, he would decide his own ending. And then one of the strangest scenes of the final days of the Second World War unfolded. While the Red Army was approaching the center of Berlin, while the Nazi government was collapsing, Hitler got married. A wedding beneath a dying city. During the final hours of April 28 and the early hours of April 29, Hitler and Eva Braun were married. It was a small ceremony, deep underground, inside a city being destroyed around them. Outside, artillery continued firing. Inside, a wedding took place. Afterward, Hitler prepared his personal and political testament. He condemned Göring and Himmler as traitors. He appointed Karl Dönitz as his successor. Consider the strange contradiction. A man who had almost no realistic ability to change the outcome of the war was still making decisions about the future government of Germany. He was still signing documents, still appointing officials, still issuing orders, as if the world outside were waiting for his decisions. But it was not. The world had already moved on. History had passed beyond the Führerbunker.
Day 0, April 30th, 1945. Berlin was burning. Soviet troops were fighting in the center of the city. Important government buildings were caught in the fighting.
The distance between the Soviet forces and the bunker had become dangerously small. Inside, everyone understood that the end was near. Hitler no longer saw a way out. The decision had been made. He and Eva Braun entered a private room. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, everything ended. Hitler died by suicide. Eva Braun also took her own life. People close to them carried the bodies outside into the Chancellery garden. Fuel was poured over the bodies. An attempt was made to burn them. Hitler did not want his body to fall into enemy hands. But there was one extraordinary detail. At the exact moment Hitler died, the war was still not over. Gunfire continued through Berlin. German soldiers were still fighting. Civilians were still hiding underground. And many people still did not know that their leader was dead.
Hitler's death was not the immediate end of the war. On May 1st, news of Hitler's death began reaching people around him. But his death did not instantly stop the fighting. Battles continued. The remaining German forces still had a choice: continue fighting or surrender. But by this point, there was no secret weapon waiting to save Germany. No massive relief army was coming. No counteroffensive could reverse the outcome. No miracle was about to happen. Only one reality remained: Germany had lost the war. In the following days, German forces surrendered in different locations. The regime that had dragged much of Europe into years of war collapsed. But the final 100 days were about much more than Hitler.
The final 100 days were not just Hitler's story. If we look at these events only from inside the Führerbunker, we miss an enormous part of the story. Outside those walls, millions of people were living through an entirely different reality. Their lives had almost nothing in common with the maps spread across Hitler's tables. To a military commander, a city could be a position on a map. To a civilian, that same city was home. In the final weeks, Berlin suffered severe shortages of food and water. Infrastructure had been damaged. Railways had been disrupted. Buildings and neighborhoods had been destroyed. Millions of people had already been displaced by the war. Women, children, and elderly people were trapped inside the destruction. A soldier might spend his final days carrying a rifle and following an order. A family might spend the entire day searching for something to eat. And this is one of the darkest realities of war. Leaders make decisions over maps. Ordinary people pay the price for those decisions. A war fought with more than guns. During these final 100 days, tanks and artillery were not the only forces shaping events. Information was also a weapon. The Allies relied on battlefield reports, intercepted communications, intelligence networks, and code breaking to understand Germany's remaining military capabilities. They wanted to know which German formations were still operational, which fronts were collapsing. What decisions was Hitler making? What were German commanders planning? And how much resistance could Germany still offer? Inside Germany, Joseph Goebbels continued calling for resistance. Radio broadcasts could still tell people to fight, but civilians could look outside their windows. They could see the destruction. They could hear the artillery. They could see enemy tanks. Eventually, propaganda collided with reality. And when propaganda meets reality, reality eventually wins.
Why didn't Hitler surrender? Now we can return to the central question. Why did Hitler refuse to surrender?
Why, when defeat had become increasingly unavoidable, did he continue ordering resistance? The answer lies in a combination of ideology, personality, his perception of betrayal, and his understanding of war and political power. For Hitler, surrender was not simply a military defeat. It meant admitting that the entire project he had built had failed. It meant acknowledging that his political vision had collapsed, that the army had been defeated, that the enemy had won. And perhaps because of this, he was willing to continue resisting rather than accept defeat. Even when Berlin was surrounded, even when German forces were under pressure from east and west, even when people closest to him were searching for ways to survive, and even after he himself acknowledged that the war was lost, he still refused to surrender. For Hitler, the end of the war had become inseparable from the end of his own existence.
The 100 days that swallowed an empire. When we look back at the final 100 days, Germany's collapse can appear sudden. It was not. The final collapse was the result of years of military defeats and growing pressure. In the east, the Red Army continued advancing. In the west, Allied forces moved deeper into Germany. Above German cities, Allied aircraft continued their attacks. On the ground, German forces lost fuel, ammunition, equipment, and manpower. Inside the government, trust was disappearing. And at the center of all of it, a man still believed that a few orders might somehow change the course of history. But history was no longer waiting for his orders. By April 25, Berlin was essentially surrounded. That same day, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe. It was perhaps one of the clearest images of Nazi Germany's final collapse. The enemy was no longer simply moving toward Germany. The opposing armies had met inside German territory. Germany had nowhere meaningful left to retreat.
The end. April 30th. Around 3:30 in the afternoon. Hitler was dead. But perhaps that is not the most important part of the story. The more important question is how he reached that moment. He did not lose power in a single afternoon. Power disappeared around him, gradually. First, armies were defeated. Then, cities were lost. Then, communication routes were destroyed. Then, allies and senior officials began thinking about their own survival. Then, Berlin was surrounded. And finally, almost nothing remained. A bunker, a table, a collection of maps, a handful of loyal followers, and a man who was still giving orders. But there was no longer an effective state capable of transforming those orders into victory. That may be the most powerful image of Hitler's final 100 days. On the last day of his life, he was still technically the leader, but there was no longer a country he could save. 100 days earlier, Hitler could still imagine that Germany might continue fighting. 100 days later, he was dead. The German military was defeated. Berlin lay in ruins.
And the regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich had collapsed. But the cost of those 100 days was far greater than the death of one dictator. Thousands more soldiers were killed. Civilians were trapped among the ruins. Families were separated. Cities were destroyed. Millions of people were displaced. That is why the final 100 days of Hitler are not simply the story of one man inside a bunker. They are the story of an army, a city, a collapsing government, and millions of ordinary people forced to pay for decisions made by their